Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Brian Douglas, or also known as BDougie, the founder and CEO of OpenSauced. OpenSauced is a platform that aims to be GitHub Insights++. It provides you with meaningful insights and data and analytics around GitHub repos, not just your own, but repos on GitHub that show you how active something is, show you how confident contributors are, and more. In our discussion, we talk about what it takes to build OpenSauced and why we're even building OpenSauced, right? We talk about getting around the GitHub API's rate limits by consuming the fire hose of events, and we go into technical details. We also discuss founder-led growth and how to build a company and get it in front of developers in a positive way. We spend quite a bit of time discussing top-down, that is enterprise first, then everyday developers, versus bottom-up, everyday developers versus enterprise first marketing. And in so doing, we identify trade-offs with each. So if you're interested in GitHub, GitHub's API, open source, analytics, and or founder-led growth, this episode is for you. Brian is also the host of the Secret Sauce podcast from OpenSauced, and there's links to that in the show notes. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of you at no cost, and this is very much separate to my day job. But to do that, we need sponsors and partners because there are costs involved. Let's take a moment to acknowledge them. The Contagious Code Podcast is partnered with Code Crafters. Code Crafters has a teaching style very similar to mine. They teach you how tools we use every day, like Git and Docker and Redis, are built by having you re-implement them in a language of your choosing, like JavaScript or Python. By doing this, you get better at JavaScript or Python or whatever language you choose, and you more deeply understand the tool that you're building. And so you double up your experience and expertise in both. If you'd like to give that a try, go to the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. They have a generous free tier, but if you want to pay using that link, you get up to 40% off. The Contagious Code Podcast is also partnered with Stately. Stately is a great way to visualize state and its transitions across your application with a beautiful visualizer. From there, you can export your state machine and or state charts to JSON, where you fill in the logic that triggers the state changes, aka the transitions, and your application is transparent, observable, testable, and robust. They also have a framework for building deterministic workflows with AI agents. If you'd like to give that a try, go to stately.ai. Finally, the Contagious Code Podcast is partnered with That Conference. That Conference is a multidisciplinary, family-first summer camp for geeks that has many tracks and great speakers and honestly some of the best keynotes around. We give away free tickets to that conference. The closest one is happening in Wisconsin at the time of recording, but it happens twice a year, once in Texas, once in Wisconsin. If you'd like to enter a raffle to win a free ticket to that conference, share this episode on social media and say you'd like to do so, and indeed, you just may win. Hey, thanks for sticking around. Now for my discussion with Brian Douglas. Brian Douglas, BDougie, what an honor having you on the Contagious Code Podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the invite and happy to get in the schedule.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about OpenSauced. I've been a fan since it started. We met in San Francisco at this Indian restaurant. And was it a company yet? Was it an idea? Where was it?
Yeah, so I think I was on sabbatical at GitHub. And, actually, I don't think I even left at that point. Because when I originally was like doing fundraising, it was actually when I just was testing the idea, and then folks were like, "Cool, I'll invest," and I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, sure, I'll take the money and I'll figure out what's next." So, yeah, that was actually before I even left GitHub at that point.
Oh, wow. Well, in this episode, we're going to dive deep into OpenSauced, maybe more from a business perspective, because we do have another episode with John John McBride specifically, about the technical details around Star Search. We will get into that as well if we have time and if there's comfort. But before we get into any of that, would you be willing to do a little bit of an introduction to yourself for the listeners, your background, and what led ultimately to OpenSauced?
Yeah. So I go by BDougie on the internet. Brian Douglas is my given name, and I am the founder of OpenSauced. Previously, I worked at GitHub leading developer relations for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was employee number 3 at Netlify. So I got to usher in what was now the Jamstack. I think it's evolving into something new at this point, but host of Jamstack Radio, another podcast, started that as soon as like the second week of the job at Netlify, and still run it today. And prior to that, I did sales, got an MBA, learned how to code, career switched, and now living here in Oakland with 2 kids and a wife.
That's awesome. You did a career switch. That's interesting. So, did you learn to code with a boot camp, or what modality was that?
Yeah, so I learned to code by building a product, or a project rather. And so I had an idea and I wanted to build it. And previously, I'd always been a tinkerer. Like I had an Android book, a Java book, and like didn't finish it, but kind of like skimmed through. Could copy and paste JavaScript like to do random stuff. But at this point, I was like, I know what needs to get done. So I'm going to focus on like learning to build something. So I built something very poorly, and then I reached out to this company called Block, signed up for their program, which at the time it wasn't called a boot camp. They ended up pivoting into a boot camp, but it was a mentorship program where I had a senior engineer would meet with me once a week, and every time I got stuck, I would just ask them questions. So like that was my learning experience, and it worked pretty well because in 12 weeks I had a fully running product, and instead of building that out, I ended up just taking a job as a junior engineer.
Awesome. That's so cool that you could just, they had this open channel where you could just reach out to a senior and get some mentorship. And then it would eventually become a boot camp. Let's talk a little bit about, and this is a tangent, but we do have a long form discussion, so we'll get to where we get. But you said Jamstack, you got to usher in that at Netlify. I think that's really cool. I had no idea you were the third employee there. The question I have is, you said Jamstack may be evolving now. To what? Is it composable architecture?
Yeah, I mean that's what Netlify is leading with, and I think like with Vercel, they dabbled in Jamstack. I think they like touched it, and that's what all the features that got confusing in Next.js is because the Jamstack was being tested by them. But like they're moving into like the serverless experience, like serverless Heroku, I think is what they were sharing internally as like the goal. It might that their vision might have like broadened quite bigger than that since the last time I talked to folks internally about this. But like what the Jamstack is today, it's evolving mainly because the serverless and the server stuff is like we came from a time 10 years ago where servers were like they were trivial but also getting expensive. But then as you started building different applications that could still be SEO friendly with pre-rendering and like statically bundled, that whole evolution, like what React and all the build tools like brought us, is what the Jamstack is. So like, it started with static site generation. It turned into like npm run build on React and Vue and applications. And then now we're in like this evolution where now servers are getting cheaper again. So you don't need to worry about like not paying for like a running server anymore. Because that was the biggest thing. Like I think what was really eye opening. I remember Brian Vaughn like either wrote a blog post or did a conference talk around like stop doing npm start for your React apps, because that was like the default. Everyone's like run npm start in a Heroku build pack and like you're good to go. And then what they found out with React is like you're running the dev server in production. So then people had like full access to your application and like all your sort of connections and webhooks through that. So then like there was a huge shift in the industry of like npm run build everything, like run it, statically generate some HTML and like get the JavaScript at runtime. And that world was like beautiful. Like that's the world I sort of grew up as a front engineer. But today, now you've got the fly.ios, you got the renders, you got all these other situations that make it so much easier to deploy like a fully functional production ready JavaScript application and like JavaScript plus, like because the world's expanding into some new languages and frameworks. So today it's muddy, and like where JavaScript APIs and markup was like the original acronym. Like even Netlify walked that back in 2020, where now Jamstack is no longer an acronym. It's just it's a vibe.
Just a word. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like now it's a vibe, but it's also like the vibes kind of like moved on. And as you saw with the LAMP stack, as we saw with every previous iteration of web architecture, like it comes and goes. And I think what's happening with Jamstack, it's going at the moment.
Right, because servers are getting cheaper because of vendors like Cloudflare making compute, like edge compute, but also compute in general, more accessible to everybody, right?
Yeah.
I think this is so cool. And just in this discussion alone so far, we're like just a few minutes, and I already get a feel for like your sort of technical excellence as a founder, as a technical founder. Let's continue the discussion. We draw lines on the podcast. Like if there's a bunch of nodes in a graph, then we draw the edges between them. So there's the finance background, the sort of transition to tech, Netlify, and then GitHub. And GitHub ultimately led to OpenSauced, right?
Yeah.
And OpenSauced and GitHub, I mean, the overlap is pretty tremendous. Like it's almost like
Yeah.
OpenSauced is a feature set of GitHub. So maybe we could explore that interplay a little bit, starting with defining OpenSauced. What is OpenSauced? What does it do? What do people use it for? And then we'll track it back to GitHub from there.
Yeah, and honestly, like depending on who I'm talking to, like I've got a different pitch, because like we're currently we have an ideal customer, and I think most folks who are listening are probably not the ideal customer, so like it's a little confusing for folks. But I do want to take one step back and say like the inspiration for OpenSauced started at Netlify, and so because my job was front end engineer, and I did not have the job of developer advocate. But what ended up happening is like I loved the product so much, and I was doing a podcast, and I was constantly going to meetups and speaking at conferences that I wanted to show like how cool the product was. And as an early employee, like I was invested in the future and success of the company. I'm still invested in the future and success of Netlify. So with that, I built a product. Basically, I was doing open source contributions just by my own accord. But then the challenge was like I couldn't maintain all the PRs that were out in flight. Like it was really hard to track that. GitHub has a way to look at all your PRs today, but that didn't exist back in 2017. So I built this like CRM tool for my open source contributions, like my PRs. And like I remember specifically Gatsby. Like I kept like fixing stuff in my Gatsby templates, but also in Gatsby. And I was
what's Gatsby? I'm joking. I'm totally joking.
yeah. Yeah. Well, what was Gatsby at this point? But yeah, so. But for folks listening, Gatsby was a Next.js competitor, very similar to that. Not a little different, but so I was just trying to track all my contributions. So I built this CRM tool, and then during the pandemic, so actually I ended up just speaking in 2017 at GitHub Universe about how I built this on top of the GraphQL API. And that is the talk that got me invited to work at GitHub. So after that talk, they're like, hey, you're using GraphQL. Like this is probably the most in-depth explanation of how to use GraphQL at GitHub that we've seen today. And like they just shipped the thing the year prior, and they had not had like that much engagement from any developer outside of GitHub. Like we're the point where they like took screenshots of my slides and open issues about things I was complaining about. So they hired me. They actually invited me to work there to lead the DevRel team. And I was the only developer advocate when I was hired. And that was actually the first advocate, because like GitHub was very bottom up. Everyone was an advocate. Everyone was allowed to speak at conferences. And as long as like you mentioned GitHub, you're able to do like around the world. But that got expensive. So they needed to have like a proper team. So I was the first one in to be specifically talking to developers and hit the ground running, talking about GraphQL, showing folks how to use that, and then eventually turn into actions. And then what I'm getting to is like, what I ended up doing is like sunsetting, not like sidelining OpenSauced. Like it was a cool thing, but then there's actually a feature at GitHub that never shipped that was going to look just like OpenSauced. So I was like, I'm not going to work on this thing. I'm just going to work on just my career. So my role at GitHub was meet with open source maintainers, find out what was missing. So like the answer to the question of like, what is OpenSauced? The thing that was missing was GitHub Insights. So there's a tab on every repo and you see insights, and you see like these bar graphs, you see like contribution, and I wouldn't call it stats, it's just numbers. So like how many contributions happened, but you don't see like what the contribution is. You don't see who made the release. So like what we wanted to build as OpenSauced and what we were building today is like GitHub Insights plus. So like how do you get deeper insight of what's happening in this repository? And that's what we set out to build. And we spent really way more time than necessary sourcing the data from GitHub, because we wanted to make sure that this was agnostic to GitHub, but also it was not like circumvented we wanted to circumvent the rate limiting problem. So every tool, like there was a popular tool called Ship Talkers that shipped like 2 weeks ago by a Microsoft employee, where you compare like your tweets and contributions and you commits. Great idea. But like same thing that I guess Reese is the name of the engineer. Same thing that he hit, which is rate limiting, is the same thing everyone hits when you build something on top of GitHub's API or integration. And then you need to progressively ask for more permissions, and then it gets not fun. And like I built that with OpenSauced previously, so I was like, how do we like build something that's not like built underneath like GitHub's limitations? So what we ended up doing is building a way. We perhaps like everyone listened to John's podcast. He was talking to you, but we built a way to basically source the data and then provide the insights. So I think I've been out of GitHub for 20 months, and I think the first 12 months really was how can we like source the data and build like a really interesting infrastructure part that we can now sustain a product and not worry about like constantly asking GitHub for help or looking for a hard pivot to something else.
How did you end up getting around this rate limit then? Did you get hired at GitHub to learn where the weak spots are and like find an entry?
I mean, I know very because I used to get always the inbounds. Like my job was like get DMs from random people about something random about GitHub. So like if you're trying to get a random name, not even random, you're getting a specific name in a repo or an org, like you DM me and I'd go find the person to like get the connection made and get you the name you're looking for. Or if you're like, hey, I got the rate limit because we're building out this whole Rust packaging system, DM BDougie. So like I was like the face, to a certain extent, the face of GitHub. Like obviously there's a CEO and a bunch of other like great engineers, but I was overly online and I was always like at events and conferences so to make sure that I was advocating for the developers that were using our product. And this is like 100% not enterprise, not like it was really specifically individual developers, folks in open source. Like I would be in those spaces. So for rate limiting, like there's a lot of nuance in like how rate limiting works. And what I found out, there's actually a better way to approach this, which we don't quite use too much, but we built this thing called a pizza oven. So if you actually clone the repo, you get the majority of the data you're looking for without tapping into GitHub. So if you're only looking at one repo always, why not just go to the commits and all the data locally first, and then go to GitHub only for the stuff you need. So like that was our first approach, which was it's a great approach. It's a great approach for enterprise. But what people want is they want to be able to like source reactions and like look at issues and like look at GitHub profiles. So we do end up going into the GitHub API, but our the way we circumvent it really is the GitHub event feed. So GitHub is a giant event feed. It's a fire hose that every 5 minutes you get you get most data that happens on GitHub. The challenge is GitHub's over 100 million users. It's a lot of data, so you don't get all of it. So we're able to go back and fill in the gaps with another service that we built internally. And so the idea is like we can get a complete look of what's happening on GitHub to a certain extent, because anything over 100 stars, it's about 260,000 repos. Anything over 1,000 stars, it's about 40,000 repos. So what we do is like we just make and stars is like not a great metric to look at, but for the sake of like this getting stuff like preemptively grab like caching stuff that people might want to look at, like stars is a good barrier. So 100 stars, you're going to guess that most folks are going to look for stuff that is above that threshold unless it's theirs. So then we built this other interaction. So if you add any repo to OpenSauced, then we'll start preemptively caching it. So if you have like 1 star or you built something yesterday, you got to add it to OpenSauced and then we'll know about it. So like we built like all this stuff, it's like it's pretty opaque because we built like again we went infrastructure like pretty hard on the infrastructure, but also had this whole podcast and had this sort of like go to market conversation with open source maintainers. So it's a bit confusing, but it'll make a lot more sense in the coming weeks, which I'm excited about.
I'm also excited about that. Okay, so it's the GitHub event feed that sort of drives the data pipeline, so to speak, at OpenSauced.
Yeah.
Is that event feed push style or pull style? Meaning, do you just subscribe once and receive a bunch of events? Or is it more you query it like on a schedule? Like you said, every 5 minutes. And then if that's the case, do they have rate limiting there as well? It would seem so.
Yeah, so it because you're getting a fire hose, it's pull style, and because it's every 5 minutes, you don't get rate limited because if you're authenticated, you get X amount of authenticated requests. So like you're just grabbing a dump. And then like we do all this sort of like introspection and filtering and like bucketing and stuff like that on our end. So like we just take the one dump. I would say at this point, I'd probably have to ask John, but I'm pretty sure we're doing every 5 minutes because that's when the new data comes through. So like that approach is very approachable for anybody who wants to build essentially what is a GitHub archive. So gharchive.org is basically this. The challenge is that is still missing data. So what we've done is we've gone through and cleaned up and structured the data in a way that's usable.
I must say, I sense a lot of confidence coming from you in this discussion. One, but you said like it'll start to make sense in the next coming weeks, but also you're just like giving away what is so much of the secret sauce, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing is like I built OpenSauced because I knew there's a missing gap in the GitHub product. It's like folks wanted to see this, but the challenge and like the confidence is like I worked at GitHub. I know the folks who still work at GitHub. I'm still open and have conversations. We just announced GitHub's investment in open source as well, just a couple weeks ago. So if somebody else builds this, I would be very happy. But I don't think anybody will. And I think that it's mainly because like you're gonna get like the ship talkers, you're gonna get like the Git history charts, you're gonna get stargazers. Everyone builds like a very small piece of the puzzle, but no one's gonna approach like the larger thing, which is like so like here's my dream, which is if I could stack rank every repository on GitHub, just like if I watch college football, like you know who the number one team is of all of the U.S. Or even like if you're a soccer fan, like you know the number one team like in the club, but like what the number one team is very subjective to like number one repo is very subjective. So like what we want to build is a standard of like how do you approach projects and say like, can I even approach this project? Should I be using this project? Does this project have futures? Like last Friday, Microsoft went and donated $2,000 to like I think about 1,000 projects, like just randomly. But I've been chatting like with Microsoft, like we're not on contract with them or anything like that, but like trying to figure out like how we can serve Microsoft, even though like they own GitHub. There's still a challenge of like not everyone knows what's happening in open source. So even an exercise of like let's donate $2,000 to 100 different open source maintainers and projects. Which ones? Well, what usually happens in 2019, I was at GitHub with the GitHub sponsors. We had shipped that in Berlin. And the thing that we said internally was going to happen happened, which is the most popular folks who talk at all the podcasts and all the conferences will get sponsored. The folks who you never see, who are like on the high reach projects, low visibility, will not get sponsored. So like, how do you surface that? And I think thanks.dev, I think a few other folks like Polar.sh provide these avenues for you to discover like how do you get yourself in front of places so that way you can also be sustained and not have to worry about being at conferences all year. So the confidence is mainly because I do truly believe like we should have competition, like we should have friends also building alongside of us. But what we're seeing right now is like with the acquisition of crowd.dev and Orbit, like there's some value, but that value is now being at Postman and at the Linux Foundation. So what we need is like folks to, or GitHub, like let's get it going. Like let's build something that we can actually have a standard or have a strategy of like how do we approach building successful open source projects.
Right. You mentioned the feature set of OpenSauced. Oh, it's such a word
it's a
that I want to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. The feature set of OpenSauced is like GitHub Insights plus effectively. But then it's such an interesting dynamic to me from like the outside because GitHub invests in OpenSauced, as you just said, but also GitHub in theory could just build this feature themselves and sort of put you all out of business. So like it's kind of this like snake eating its tail type of thing, right? And you said you're in discussions with GitHub. So I guess is through the partnership with you, there's likely some type of guarantees that y'all just build it instead?
Yeah, I don't think we have guarantees. I think what we have is just the classic build versus buy, or like GitHub has at this point 3,000 employees. I don't know if that's a public number, but that's roughly the number of what they have, which is like half the size of Stripe, still smaller than Slack. Like GitHub's a very focused company, and they're very focused on doing like collaboration on Git and GitHub. Like that's the bread and butter. Now they have this AI thing, which is Copilot, which now that's the focus right now is like how do you get developers and developer adjacent teams to be successful using GitHub? And that's the focus. So like when you only have finite resources to ship that directive, which is like very successful for them. Like I think I don't know if they share public numbers, but it's extremely successful for them. And I think now you see all these other similar products like a SourceGraph Cody or Magic.dev or now Poolside. Like these are all tools that look just like, well, they're similar to Copilot. They're in the same space. And now the developers benefiting from that. But for that same reason, like GitHub doesn't have the bandwidth to also manage the Insights product and like do R&D and advance that. And like what we ended up getting investment from the GitHub fund. And like the promise with the GitHub fund is like they're investing in the future of products adjacent to open source and to Git and GitHub, but also like the most recent GitHub accelerators all focus around the AI space. So like GitHub is making these bets to be like to make sure that other folks will continue the path and then continue the journey. And I think it was a no-brainer when former employee starts a thing and says, I'm going to build something that's very, very complementary to GitHub. This need GitHub support. So like what it looks like is like we're part of their technology partner program. Like we're part of the GitHub for Startups program. Like we're building on GitHub Enterprise. So like we're very, not intentionally, but like I just know GitHub very well. So like we're a very great story for GitHub. As we succeed, like the GitHub succeeds.
That's so cool. Because like to somebody with not a lot of context, it would almost seem like these are opposed. Like, oh my gosh, like OpenSauced is outside of the collaborative features, it's competing on insights, but it's actually completing instead of competing. I so love that picture.
Yeah. We took VC money, and I think I talked to some VCs a couple years ago. Like when I was first getting started, I was like, let me go test the waters. And I think out the gate, everyone wanted me to compete directly at GitHub. And like I think that's a great thing that people can try and do and stuff like that. But in my mind, it's like, why? Like I'd rather just like go operate in a blind spot. And like if we need to slingshot past what GitHub's capability is, like then we'll do that. And like as we expand, like GitLab, I've definitely had conversation with GitLab already, like how OpenSauced fits with GitLab and how we build something that like integrates with that. I just don't think GitLab's like currently focused as heavily on the open source side. I might be speaking out of turn, but I think where they are right now is like the DevOps tool chain, the pipeline there, like that's their bread and butter. And the open source stuff, like it happens, but it's not as interesting when we look at the data. Like even like looking at like, so we have a couple of these metrics. So we're calling like these like when you walk into the neighborhood, I kind of want to know like what the walk score is or like what's going on.
Right.
So the thing that has been confusing for a lot of maintainers and a lot of smaller companies is like, I don't know what OpenSauced is for. Like, how would I use it? And it's mainly because like if you don't have more than 20 repos, you're probably not going to have a great time on OpenSauced yet. But we built this other thing, which are repo pages. So we had a product hunt launch. We had a lunch week a couple weeks ago. So every day we launched a feature, and repo pages was one of them. But on the repo pages, we have these dev stats, and these are things like lottery factor. So identifying if more than two people do the brunt of all the work, more than 50% of the work, then there's a high lottery factor score. So if someone wins the lottery, they're probably not going to come back and contribute to this code base.
It's such a nicer name for it. I've heard like bus factor, but lottery factor is so much friendlier.
Nebraska projects are the other thing, like that SKCD comic where it's like the one Lego brick. If you pull that, like some random developer in Nebraska is like still maintaining it. But then we had this thing that we're shipping today, actually, called Contributor Confidence. Actually, it shipped. It went live. So Contributor Confidence is of the folks who star and fork projects, like what's the chance of them making contributions? And this is like a thing that's not gameable. Like the idea is like, if I make a contribution to your project, I would increase your confidence because I make contributions to other projects. So you can't just like, you again, you can get a bunch of stars. You can do like, there was a popular company that's still out today, which they built like this how to, basically there's the documentation of like how to do this X technology. And whenever you authenticated with the project to use their tool, they would star the repo. So like what I'm getting at is like you could totally buy stars, you can game stars, but you can't build confidence unless you truly take on contribution from folks. So like we built this intentionally, that's not a gameable interaction. But then we got a couple other dev stats we're shipping pretty soon. Something like PG Vector. What I noticed is Andrew Kane is sole maintainer of PG Vector. PG Vector is like the tool that gets integrated in all these new AI enabled database companies. I think MySQL's got a similar thing that's not PG Vector. But what I'm getting is Andrew is solo maintainer. You get very, very like interesting lottery factor when you look at the data, but he doesn't show up in the data. And the reason for that is like OpenSauced is PR first. And we had to make a very hard decision of like what is good for the open source community and like what's bad. And if you do a PR and you have a description and you have a title and you had cut releases, that's good because anybody can now jump in and have context. But if you ship contributions directly to the default branch with like, yes, there's issues. Yes, there's like proper commit titles, but that story gets lost a bit because of trunk-based development. We wanted to build a metric to identify, yes, Andrew's doing a ton of work, but what he's not doing is he's not really telling the story properly in our eyes. And like what we have to do, like for us in OpenSauced, is have an opinion. So like, we can have the wrong opinion. That's totally fine. But we created this stat that will ship pretty soon called Cowboy. We're calling it YOLO coding. So the idea is cowboy coding, but we call them YOLO coders. And if anybody has a high YOLO coder frequency, it's just basically core team is just shipping directly to the branch with no review and no interaction. And the reason for that is like if I'm Microsoft and I'm donating $2,000 to a project, and I see like a high YOLO coder, I might ask a question of like, hey, could you start doing PRs? Because like I'd love to support this, but like this is not set up for like proper governance and longevity. So again, like 2024, this is what I said internally for the team. Opinions 2024. Like this is an election year in the US. Like what we're doing is putting out opinions. We could be wrong on these opinions, but what we need is like a standard for the industry to know like what a good successful open source project is. And it can't be stars. So like we're building more and more to tell the story. So and frankly, like all that stuff I shared is all free, accessible to anybody through a repo page today. And like that's not our paid product. It's just more of like I'm a DevRel by heart. It's our go to market for just getting attention to eventually get people to build workspaces.
That is so cool. And I can't wait to play with all of them. And I'd love to dive into repo pages in a little bit more detail after this next question I have for you. But because these are like really awesome, really specific insights. And I've heard that the stars be condemned as a vanity metric over and over again for a variety of reasons. But before we dive into the new insights, you mentioned OpenSauced started as GitHub Insights ++. So I have to believe there were insights before this, which were based on more than just stars. It was probably like, rate of open to close pull requests or something like that. Can we get a broad sort of overview of the key insights that OpenSauced initially offered and that offers today, without accounting for the repo pages specifically?
Yeah, so like because we spent a lot of time to get into data, we were really based around pull request. And if we can see the frequency, which is PR velocity of pull request that are merged and closed and open, like that gives you a really good indication of like. So actually, if I take a step back, our first customer is DigitalOcean, and it was during Hacktoberfest. And so like I'd met you, and then like ended up a couple months later, I pitched to DigitalOcean. I was like, hey, Hacktoberfest, you come talk to GitHub every year. There's a big pain point of like spam, and like the Spamtober thing that happened in 2021. I specifically was sitting in the Zoom call with the DigitalOcean team, and they're like, hey, day one, we've got this weird spam thing. A month prior, I was like, hey, well, sorry, I was constantly always in the room. Like my whole DevRel persona is like I'm the person in the DMs. I'm not the person on stage. Though I do on stage, I do host a podcast. I so much rather be in the DMs and like be party planning and like getting people access and privilege. But so I had a lot of conversations about like Hacktoberfest and like things that I saw to be problematic. Other things that the team brought up as well, but. So day one of 2021 Hacktoberfest was like Spamtoberfest, and everyone can look up. You can Google that and find it on Hacker News and Reddit. But we needed a solution, and the solution was, and I literally pitched this like, "Hey, you should make an opt-in. Like, if you're going to do Hacktoberfest, you've got to opt in as a maintainer to say my project is good for getting contributions from." So the two ways you opt in is like you add a label to the PR that says Hacktoberfest accepted. The maintainer has to do that. Or if that's too much work, the maintainer can just add a topic. So every GitHub repo has a topic. You can say like React or JavaScript or Zig or Rust. If you add the topic Hacktoberfest, you're opted in every year. There's no heavy lift, which means like we've constricted Hacktoberfest to anywhere in GitHub to just anybody who's opted in, which was great because 80,000 projects opted in that year. So like. It was good because a lot of folks wanted to be a part of it. But the reality is like that also made it easy for OpenSauced. So like when we shipped this the year later, I was like, hey, remember that thing I said about adding like opting in? We took all opted in projects, we put them to one dashboard, and now you can see 500, like in October of 2021, 500,000 PRs. So now you have 500,000 PRs. Now you can see all that contribution in 30 days in one dashboard. But not only could you do that, you could also filter by spam. So anything I marked for spam, now you could go identify, okay, this is the problematic stuff. So like I think strapping was a big hit for spammers. Free code camp, always a big hit for spammers.
But what's the criteria here for spam?
So based on Hacktoberfest and the guidelines, if something is spam, you got to label it spam. So that way they can mitigate, like if folks are spamming you, trying to get contributions, then they can be marked. But the challenge is,
so the maintainers would mark it as spam, or
correct?
Like,
yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
So yeah, this is all manual based. Like we do have a way to identify spam programmatically. We haven't shipped that yet, but the idea is like if you've been marked as spam, then you're marked as spam across the board. So even legitimate PRs, you don't get a T-shirt. Like they don't do T-shirts anymore analysis. You plant the tree, but like just that one interaction is a thing that's almost hard, it's really hard to do on GitHub without building your own tooling and with 500,000 PRs you're going to rate limited. Like it's not a approachable problem to solve outside of GitHub. So what we did is we built an approachable solution to this problem outside of GitHub through OpenSauced. And it was like a magical experience to like see all that contribution, all that storytelling directly in there. Like the folks internally at DigitalOcean could be like, "Hey, we did this, what we did. Here are the numbers. Here are the stars. Here's the top 10 list," and that was our product. Like that's what we shipped. As soon as I left GitHub in September, October of that month, we shipped this for Hacktoberfest. And so actually I forgot what the how I got to this point, what the question was.
That's great. The question was what insights? You mentioned it's like GitHub Insights plus plus.
Got it. Yeah. So the insights were PR velocity, spam. We also talked about labeling PRs, so like percentage of labeled PRs, because this is the thing that it's bigger in the CNCF projects, but things that go unlabeled, it just shows that there's less governance or operations when it comes to getting stuff merged and reviewed. But it gives us a good idea of like what's newer projects versus what's like got structure in it. So like those were literally, I think we removed some of these off the page because we had to like reshift based on the infrastructure changes. But yeah, I think those are the most part: spam, PR velocity, label percentage, and and acceptance rate, because acceptance is basically specifically for Hacktoberfest. So a lot of PRs don't get merged and during October, and a lot of PRs just get closed. So like of the 500,000 PRs, which I used to know the numbers off the top of my head, but spam was 1%. 1% of the entire month was spam. So which not too bad. But again, like this is the education thing. So a lot of stuff could have been spam, but it wasn't marked as spam, which is why programmatically it's going to be a lot easier to identify the stuff in the future. But then the thing that was acceptance rate, I forgot what it was. It was like in the 13, 17% of all PRs open actually got merged and accepted.
That's so cool. So it sounds like it was delivering OpenSauced even as an initial, I don't want to say prototype because it maybe sounds like belittling, but as a small product or as an early product, was already delivering value. And I love this because it's based in what the customer wants. DigitalOcean, it's like, hey, we don't know. And I've been a part of teams in a DevRel. So I used to lead DevRel at various companies. And yes, Hacktoberfest was always painful because we just don't know. And we often got spam and we got people, like you said, trying to create pull requests just for the sake of saying, I got a green tile and now give me a t-shirt. Wow, that's really cool that you had the sensitivity to the problem and then in collaboration with your customer, figured out exactly the best way to solve it.
Yeah, and there's a thing happening right now where folks are getting spammed. It's like the React project. There's a few other projects that just get a bunch of PRs and issues or discussion. Before it was discussions, so you get a bunch of discussions open programmatically, and just basically attacked DDoS inside the issues. And the challenge of closing all that stuff or like mitigating that or blocking people, it's GitHub doesn't have really good, like Discord has really good banning functionality. GitHub does not. They have those features, but they're kind of buried, because they were never like a top of the mind thing. And I think this will change in the coming years, or probably in the coming months. Like I don't have inside information, but I know it's GitHub's paying attention. But the challenge is, it's like there was a whole thing of they called it ransomware, which is like they call protestware. So during the war in Russia and Ukraine, folks would go. They went to like the React repo and protested with a bunch of issues and a bunch of discussions. Like this attacked specifically the React repo. And I think this was actually, I don't know if anybody wrote anything about this, but I know socket.dev for Ross was really paying attention to this because like he has eyes on all this stuff based on his product. But that type of stuff, it's not approachable. It's not a thing that you don't get to until you get 100 million developers on one platform. And then now you have specifically with the XC vulnerability, like what we've shipped recently. Actually, it's still in, I think it just got merged. Oh, sorry, it's in PR right now. But like GT75 is the guy who circumvented, social engineered his way to become a maintainer of the XC project. XC is now it's a plugin inside the Postgres infrastructure, and over the course of 2 years, slowly infiltrated and said like, oh yeah, hey, I shipped like an innocuous contribution. And that contribution got merged. And then a month later, hey, I've got a second contribution. Cool. Hey, random person comes in like 6 months later, is like, hey, is this project still maintained? Like literally, like this is the bad cop coming in, like random name, no avatar, and they're like, oh yeah, it's maintained. It's just a little slow. It's like, oh, well, I see GT75 got stuff merged. Like, why don't you just make them a maintainer so that way? It's laughable. It's like I joke it's a Hulu documentary because it's not quite Netflix level, but Hulu would be like the level that this would be a documentary for. But then they have a third party person who's like, oh yeah, I validate. Yeah, Gia should be out of nowhere, like random American sounding name. You should make Gia a maintainer. So fast forward a month later, they're a maintainer, and they're just like merging normal PRs. Slowly ends up changing like the actual email that you reach out to for vulnerabilities and stuff like that to GT75's email, like underneath the radar of like made a bunch of changes, but also I'm going to change this thing. And then slowly starts adding weird stuff to the package that got caught in February of this month. Sorry, it wasn't February. It was last year, November or December of last year. It was disclosed in February of this year by a Microsoft employee. So like the value is like, again, like open source, like we have a broader vision, and we don't want to go to like the rah Hacktoberfest. Hacktoberfest is a great engagement for us to just source the data and see what happens. There's not a lot of folks building stuff at the size of Hacktoberfest, like small hackathon stuff like that. That's cool, but what I wanted to build is a business that would actually scale to enterprise, but also scale to like the broader community. And it'd be hard pressed to find a project that's built using GitHub data doesn't feel like a side project. And like what we want to do is build something it feels like a side project today, but we want to build something that has some longevity. So like what we shipped is being able to see all comments for one individual. And then what we're building is the original vision for Star Search that we shipped a couple weeks ago was find developers before you know who they are. And the idea is like everyone thinks of recruiting as, oh yeah, you can find developers like as they're making contributions, I can go hire them. It's like, sure, but like they're probably not gonna, like if they're desperate or they really need a job, yes, they'll talk to you. But like most developers, they're contributing. They don't want to get messed around with like recruiters and pitched for a bunch of stuff. So like it's not really a viable business, and like we're not approaching that at all. But like what's even more valuable is like now I can see GT75's all his comments or their comments, because who knows if it's 1 or 10 people, but see all their comments, but also I can see all the people they commented to and see the sort of web of interaction. So I pitched this idea, and I don't think we'll ever ship it, but the idea for Star Search was 6 degrees of Evan Bacon, and Evan Bacon being like Expo contributor, maintainer at Expo, contributor to React Native. Like if I could see where my connection to me and Evan Bacon are, or your connection to Evan Bacon through open source interactions, comments, that would be a really interesting play, because now you can start really thinking through like these state actors who are now interacting and activating spam. Like you're not going to put spam on your main account. Like if your job is on GitHub, which a lot of folks, that's where it is, and you do spam on your second account, and your second account is linked to your first account because of like clever things that GitHub can do anything internally of trust and safety, then now you're putting yourself at risk of like shutting down all your accounts. So which you can mitigate spam pretty quickly. So the broader vision is like we have the data now. Now we can start telling stories with the data. And what I've been doing like on YouTube and on X at this point is like, let me just tell you a couple stories of how you would use open source. So if anybody's at all confused with open source, like you just follow me on Twitter and like or X, and I've got some videos that I'm just like walking through the product.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll put links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you for that. So the value proposition is so clear for businesses, or especially around Hacktoberfest, but throughout. For example, I can see a world based on what you just said where Meta's wondering about the quality of React, right? Like, why is everybody creating spam here? Or are people like divesting from React? Is everybody into Solid now? What's happening with our community? And they could just get those insights and then maybe turn them actionable.
Here, even better, like I'm Astro, and I get a lot of forks of Astro of like cool things that people are running long-standing forks on other projects. Like GitHub had a long-standing fork of Rails. there are cool features that are out there on forks that have not made it back upstream. And like, whether you're MIT license or Apache, whatever, like how do you discover what's out there? Like who are the people you should talk to tomorrow? Like, so Backstage is a project built at Spotify. And now Spotify is now building a hosted version of Backstage as like our go-to-market offering for whatever reason. But like now they're going to catch up after 4 years of not really touching this thing to now have a go-to-market thing. Start with the forks, like start with the folks who have been contributing to Backstage and start doing some product development by storytelling and having conversations. Like even like you mentioned Facebook and Meta, like PyTorch. Like PyTorch is like PyTorch, Llama. Like PyTorch started Llama walk so Llama could run, which is ironic because llamas they do run. But what I'm getting at is the like Facebook or Meta or whatever, they specifically can go into like now this like strong ecosystem of open source contributors and now have experts to source, get feedback on. I'd say like Apple and Swift, same deal. Like everyone saw the private cloud thing with the whole AI, ChatGPT, private cloud, super secure. It's a very interesting like concept that Apple has like now finally shipped what their cloud offering is, which is not, doesn't look like Azure and doesn't look like AWS. It's Apple's own thing that's very specific to them, all built on server-side Swift. So now like Apple's now directive is like, hey, we need to get more people using Swift as a premier language to build servers. So like, how do we build that story? How do we see where forks are happening? How do we see where side projects are like running? So like, again, like this really makes sense for the enterprise top down, like what OpenSauced is doing. Because if you have tons of data, tons of interest, it makes a ton of sense. If you have a large enterprise and you only have private repos, OpenSauced also works for that as well. So like, that's the other half of the story that we haven't been public about and been sharing, but like we have a plan for how do you get multi-tenant solutions to churn a bunch of insights inside of private repos. So like the OpenSauced open source journey is really the stepping stool to like tell a bigger story, which again, like I think everyone like talk to, if you give me a time, I could tell you the full visions. Like if you're a VC, like you've had this pitch already, like the folks who invested in this thing, this is why they invested, is because there's a broader thing that no one's really attacking, no one's approaching. And I think the biggest concern that keeps me up at night is like, we don't have competition. So like, are we doing something crazy or are we just the first one through the gate?
I invested just because I think you're cool and and the dinner was nice, but and also of course I the same reasons you mentioned, but that wasn't the primary reason. In any case, okay, that value is so cool. So if I heard correctly, it sounds like there's a lot of value in the top down, so to the enterprise way around feature discovery, right? Because you just look at what everyone else is doing in forks and go like, people want this, we'll build it first class. But also people discovery. These are the people building it, so we'll maybe hire them. And that perfectly complements the sort of attrition, like who's leaving our project or how long are issues stale or all of this. And I love that this has gone to the enterprise first. Could you maybe, as a DevRel, you've worked in DevRel for long. I think you've worked in DevRel before I even started working in DevRel. And so I tip my hat to you for that, being the one of the DevRel OGs. This is a common question that comes up when working around DevRel at DevTools companies. Do we go with a top-down first or bottom-up first approach? And I've seen companies make this mistake, right? Some companies have gone one way or another, and it's failed to prove value, and then they go, we're running out of money, we need to switch. How do we mitigate companies from going down the wrong path?
Yeah, so our model is actually the sandwich model. And it's actually popularized by Ed Sim. So our investor is BoldStart Ventures. Ed is one of the founders of BoldStart Ventures. And the idea is like you have a top-down and a bottom-up strategy at the same time. And like it's an investment, but it's easier to, like, I would say it's easier because like I'm still in the middle of this. But approaching this earlier, like you don't make a commitment to either, but you're doing both at the same time. So like the top-down was, the way it looked for us is like I had, through DevRel, and I imagine everyone who's DevRel is like a future CEO, because like if you're truly building connections and storytelling, like those are the two things, the hardest thing as a founder is like, one, connect with people, tell them about the product, but also tell a story. And so if you have the story, then what I've been doing is telling the story to large enterprises. So man, I don't know how much I divulge, because a lot of this stuff's like it is a secret sauce. But like there was a company who almost IPO'd during the ZERP era. They didn't IPO. They're still going strong, but we discovered in their SDKs, and I've actually got a bus factor video on the open source YouTube about this. I don't disclose the company because like they're not a customer and like this is their pain point, but they had SDK in the Django ecosystem. And it was the one SDK because their product is built on Django, so it was not maintained by the company. It was a community SDK. Everything else they maintain. And when we approached them, like, hey, we got this data. So I pitched DigitalOcean, I pitched this company. And we approached them and said, hey, I'm exploring the idea of open source. I probably will quit my job for this, but wanted to like validate, like people would pay for this first. So like, let's have a coffee. And like, cool. These are the projects that we care about. And so I pulled them all up into like one list, which was like at the time an Excel spreadsheet that is dumped from Postgres. And I was like, here are all the repos. Here's like a ton of data. Like, here's an idea of PR velocity. And he's like, because I was talking to this person, and they're like, oh yeah, this project. That one's really big for us because it's a community project we don't own and maintain, but we don't have any insights because in GitHub, if you're org maintain or owner, you see everything. But if you're not, you only see what everyone else sees. So what we saw is there were only, at the time, 3 contributors in the previous month, but in the entire 6 months, there was only 1 consistent. And what they disclosed to me is like this is they basically they're a marketplace where they have revenue go through the usage of this. So like folks might be able to figure out what I'm talking about. But anyway, the marketplace was $500 million of business, like of revenue goes through this one SDK. So they have a bunch of them, but this is like their bread and butter, and only 1 person contributed to it. So I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Well, this seems like something you would probably want to get eyes into, right? He's like, yeah. So we continued the conversation with them. They had a couple, like they did an IPO, so they had a couple changes in the team, and folks had left. So not quite a customer yet. But what I'm getting at is like, okay, there's some value here that if I'm a big company that's built on top of open source of these SDKs, and like people leave, they come and go, where's the brain trust? Like, where's the knowledge of these projects? Like, where does that go when that person leaves to go to like a Netflix or leaves to go to Microsoft? So that now it's like, what if I could just tell you the core team of this project in 2017? Would that be helpful? It's like, yeah, that'd be extremely helpful because now we can contract, we can ask questions of like, hey, we found something. Can you like come in for like just an hour meeting, like and like help the team out with that? And we'll pay you for your time. Like that stuff is like in San Francisco, like everyone does that. Like I'll go chat with Airbnb engineers about like how you did the thing like 10 years ago. And like people just cool to talk about that. In open source, you're cool to talk about, oh yeah, I solved the problem this way. Like you just obscure any sort of private information, but majority of it's like it's pretty above board to like talk like that. But like that's a thing that's almost impossible to do without a lot of like sourcing data or a lot of word of mouth conversations. And I think we're at a point where open source has got mature enough where I actually talking to Kelsey Hightower about this on my podcast. And Kelsey's an amazing person. He's been around the block, and I consider him OG DevRel because the dude's he's been doing it longer than I have, and he's still doing it even though he's retired. But what I'm getting at is Kelsey was talking about today. If you start an open source technology and it gets successful, it is almost near impossible to not take money for it. And like you could name a bunch of projects, and like we'll count down the hours of the days until this thing is like either a foundation or it's a VC backed startup. But like this is the day we live in today, which is like success lives within this like the projects with tons of adoption in open source. And not every open source project will be successful, but if it's the difference of like you work in this for 25 years and like this take donations through GitHub sponsors and Open Collective, or someone gives you $12 million to go scale a business. And like, cool, I'll take a salary, I'll take the $12 million, and if this thing like fizzles out, at least I have a retirement account and I could go do something else or get a job anywhere else. So like it's like the Linux Foundation, like not the Linux Foundation because that's Foundation, but like Linus Torvalds, like that world of building something like this cool little server thing, like building an alternatives to Microsoft Windows, like that world. Like we're past part of that world. Like we'll still have that stuff. We'll be hobby projects and side projects, but there's a future where open source makes sense. Where I now have tons of legacy conversations code that I should be able to tell a story around, so that way I can get adoption. So that way I can like do conferences and get funding and etc. And yeah, like we're primed for that conversation, which is why I feel like just looking at code contribution data and comments and commentary is enough for us. And I think where everyone's like, we should add Stack Overflow or Twitter or Reddit, like none of that stuff is actually important to us, because once you take the conversation outside of GitHub or outside of the actual Git commits, then we're looking at community development, we're looking at DevRel engagement. And I think like DevRel is a great thing, but I think we're also seeing a shift in that too as well, where like you no longer can just like show up to a conference and speak like 6 times a year and like you're good, your job's done. Like now you gotta be a YouTuber, you gotta run a podcast, you gotta like be in sales calls. Like DevRel it's evolving intentionally, and it should be evolving. Like we can't just consider like, because tech's evolving every 2 years, so like DevRel's got to evolve with it, and go-to-market's got to evolve with it. Open source has got to evolve, and like a lot of folks are very nostalgic about like how it used to be and how it should be. And at the end of the day, it's like I got a kid who's 10 years old who's like doing little scratch games on the computer. Like, will he be writing code day to day at a job? Like, I don't know. Will he be like prompting himself into like a full career? Probably, but like that's for him and his career, and like for me to just make sure he goes to school and has success. But like it won't be like today. Like we might not even have GitHub when he graduates high school.
Yeah, because OpenSauced would acquire it. No, I'm just kidding. No, but okay. I wonder though. We're talking about like top down versus bottom up, and doing both at OpenSauced in terms of like go to market. It's a small team, right? Like I don't know that it's a huge. How many people are you at this point?
So we're 8 today. Yeah.
Right, so you're less than the fingers on my hands, and you're like my concern with doing both is how do you balance it, because one may be more lucrative than the other, and I say this because I know tons and tons. We've spoken with many founders on the podcast of SaaS products and developer tools, who I feel like the consensus is look, engineers earn enormous salaries for the most part, definitely like relative to like non-engineers. Yet we somehow just don't like paying for stuff. And there's always a difficult conversation around like if you have a SaaS product, what do you charge? Will developers pay for it? Usually everyone just wants the free tier, and I don't quite understand this. And so maybe bottom up isn't as important, even if you're doing both, maybe 25 bottom up, 75 top down. How do you all manage like balancing both in a good way?
Yeah, I mean at this point it's like 95% top down. And so basically we have a team of 8. So like I'm basically head of sales, head of customer support, which I'm doing an okay job at. But then we have 4 engineers who are basically, we've got one person, John, who's heavy on infrastructure, heavy on the API, the data, even the AI stuff. So John's like driving ship there. Brandon, who kind of fits in the middle between front end and what John's doing. So he's I call him my floater. Like, he's going to solve the hard problems. He's usually arm's length of like, hey, I've got a feedback I got from a customer. Could you ship something today? So like that's Brandon. And then we've got 2 folks on the front end. Nick, who can do the API stuff, but he's like very, very big in the Next.js stuff. So like that's a team, and Zay is also on the front end as well. Like that's a team, and like we're nimble with those engineers, and then I'll fill in the gaps if I need to. And then we have a designer, Isa, who former at Google, worked on YouTube, creator tools. She is specifically like she can code as well. That's the other benefit, is like she can go throw a bunch of Tailwind together and help out with like polishing components. So like let's just get it close enough, ship it, and like Isa can polish it if needed. And then Becca is also an engineer, helps with the docs, the DevRel, go to market. So like the idea is like we can spread the wealth and then attack a problem when we need to. So like whenever we do a launch, we're all on the same page. We're shipping the stuff. Right now, we're not currently tracking to our launch, so we're all basically doing cleanup and like fixing the stuff that we wanted to get to, and like shipping new dev stats. And then we'll have a new launch in like September. So then probably by the end of July, we're all on the same page for like 6 weeks. We're shipping the same thing. And then I get a bunch of like large conversations of like, oh yeah, by the way, this would be a great thing to have as part of like this deal. Cool, let's turn around a prototype or a proof of concept. We're all on the same page for for a week or a sprint. So I guess what it really is like, I think the world of like $5 SaaS or $25 SaaSes, like that world is kind of moving away. And like what I wanted to do, like when I left GitHub, I wanted to solidify like, could we get a large contract out the gate? And I did that with DigitalOcean. So then could we sustain this business without charging developers to use it? And I know that's because you hear the same thing. Developers can also talk with both sides of their mouth, which is like, oh, well, like I want to connect my GitHub account, but there's no pricing. So then like, am I going to pay eventually? I was like, yes, you will, but like the paid tier is like high because like we don't want to talk to you about paying. Like we just want you to use it and give us feedback. But then they're like, well, if you tried to sell me something, then I'd be a little more comfortable. And it's like at that point, if we tried to sell you something, it will be the wrong thing. So like at that, we don't want 100 people paying for the wrong thing, and then we have to go kill it because we figured out, oh yeah, it turns out this is the thing we actually want to build, and now we're stuck here. So because of the beauties of VC money, it's like we can punt on that for a little bit. But then I worked at Netlify as employee number 3, and like the biggest complaints we got was that we were only charging $10 a month. And it's like, how do you charge $10 a month for all this stuff that you're giving? And it's like the truth is because S3 and because we use Kubernetes to like scale and deploy your infrastructure and run npm run build on your behalf. So like because everyone was running npm start and you paid Heroku $7 a month, but then you paid like $50 a month when you had a serious project. They're like, why would I pay Netlify $10 a month for like way more? And like the answer is because we figured out how to like scale and build a bigger business, and like we got to start like literally 10 years after or 8 years after Heroku. Like that's why you could pay less. So like for OpenSauced, what we need is like folks just use it for free, and like please don't ask any more questions. Like if you don't want to use it, that's totally fine. If you want to use it, give us feedback, but like asking why you aren't paying is like probably not the question you should be asking. Like just use it and then like delete your account if it doesn't work out for you, because the top down is a bigger opportunity. Like if you think, so at this point, if you're at this part of this podcast and you list this far, you're probably really invested and engaged. So I'll be more free flowing in numbers, but like Microsoft, 6,000 public repos. So like let's forget about all private stuff. They're bought into GitHub. Azure DevOps was acquired into GitHub. So like a lot of the story that people don't talk about with GitHub and the acquisition is Azure pipelines, Azure DevOps, artifacts all got merged into GitHub, and GitHub became the solution for Microsoft. So like they push GitHub hard. So the story is like now everything's on GitHub. So like whether you're TFS or your Git or whatever SVN, well they don't use SVN, but they use Git. You're on GitHub. So that journey is like 6,000 public repos. The number that they shared with me is like in the high five figures of engineers that touch open source and code at Microsoft. So like that's a huge number to look at. If you're just trying to track that data inside of an open source, like that's a better opportunity than me charging like a random, like a super base, like $25 a month. So that way they can see the insights in their project. So like at the end of the day, it's like, I'd rather go spend way more time with a larger customer and figure out what that product is than to like get 1,000 $25 paying customers and then have a conversation with them like every time something breaks or like it doesn't work. Like the expectation if it breaks and you're not paying anything is like, hey, sorry, it's broken. Like we'll fix that. Thanks for telling us. But the expectation of it's you paying $25 is like, I can't believe I'm paying $25 for this thing and it's always broken. And like I keep finding edge cases, and yeah, so that's our journey. Like I'd rather spend way more time on the top down, mainly because I've seen this time and time again. I've seen other folks build a very similar product while at GitHub, and I'm just basically taking the confidence is basically because I've seen it, I've lived it. So the opportunity is like I can now fix all the mistakes everyone would make prior, and just like build a thing that's going to work and build this thing that's sustainable.
That is so cool. I so appreciate the nuance you captured there towards biasing towards top down for that reason, because top down is in many ways higher stakes, but also higher reward, right? And then you actually probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but you establish like product market fit with more certainty faster if you go top down, because this is like these are enterprises willing to pay, like literally pay, and not small amounts, but like huge amounts usually for the product, but also for the reliability guarantees. And then you go, okay, we're onto something here. How can we then subsidize this for everybody? That is so cool, and I think that's a lesson in there for every founder.
This was like the strategy for Netlify, which is like large enterprise customers paying 7 figures for a large like hosted pipeline that had dedicated servers for them. So you just like repeat Netlify just for one enterprise customer, which costs a good amount of money that they can justify, but you could also justify support people dedicated to just them. And I think like the again, like the journey for open source founders, or even like just founders and startups, is like it's a lot easier to be like a rah, do a product hunt launch and get a bunch of people excited and like look at the numbers. But like I have the data. Like any open source company that had like a large, like huge inflection of stars, you could see the interaction like from that point. So if you take like pick one, like there was one a couple years ago, Make Plane. Everyone was like they bought stars, blah blah blah. Like in reality, they didn't buy stars. They were Hacker News twice. Like that's how they got a bunch of traction, which is great for them. It's an amazing journey and story. But you look at them now a year later from that, and it's still the two founders like shipping the code, which tells me is like they haven't scaled the team, which is fine. Like it's totally fine. It just feels like a combination of Make Plane. I think it's a great product. I don't think I'd use it personally because I just don't think about project management that way. But for folks who need that, check it out. What I'm getting at is like you can see the frequency of contribution, release, features, all through open source data. So like the story is like they had a huge like bump, but I don't like probably stress it was too early for them. So like it would have been way more beneficial if they had a huge bump 6 months later, post funding, to then have a story of like, okay, we had a huge bump, now we can convert people because we're ready. And I think a lot of times we get a lot of folks will get 10,000 stars in a weekend, take funding the next weekend, and then now what? And then it's like a slow trickle of like irrelevancy. So it's and I again like I've got to have strong opinions because I'm a founder. I'm trying to make a business, but also I do want to support open source and like tell a journey and story. So like I got to believe that what we're doing is right and is the best solution for everybody. But in reality, maybe it's not. Like maybe getting a 10,000 stars through Hacker News, like it works for a lot of people. It's proven to like be successful for certain people. But I think the reality is like we're now seeing like the distribute. Like I just saw a LinkedIn post of like distribution of VC funding, and it's going back to like San Francisco, New York, like maybe Chicago, London. It's like all the major hubs. So like in the world that we were living in, like I could be remote, live wherever I wanted to, like start a company and scale it to like, hundreds of $1 million in revenue. Like we kind of haven't seen that yet. And the requirement of at least having founders in San Francisco or in major hubs talking to venture capital or talking to customers, like we're going back to that world. Like in person is definitely happening again. Like you can still work remote, but your leadership, your team is probably going to have to be somewhere close, or at least twice a year flying to San Francisco. And I live here, so I'm biased, but I see everyone who flies in here, and I have coffee with all of them. So like I've seen the pattern.
Yeah, I have to say, I just noticed also that Josh Miller, the CEO of the browser company of New York, formerly living in Paris, has also just announced he's moving to New York because of that exact reason you mentioned.
Yeah.
You brought up an interesting point that I think is quite cool, because like a big problem with DevRel is it's hard to measure. Typically, like it's easier to measure marketing if you use UTMs and things like this. But for open source projects like cal.com, they do a big product hunt launch. How do you measure the open source impact of such a launch? I guess OpenSauced is the answer to this, right? You can see the influx of stars maybe, but stars, as we know, are somewhat of a vanity metric. So you can also see, okay, but how has our active community grown? And I think that's tremendous that for open source projects, you offer that value. I'd love to maybe talk about repo pages in a little bit more depth, because you did share a number of new features that you're shipping or have shipped as of today and will ship in the future. And I'd love to talk about those in a little bit more detail and understand them. So you mentioned lottery factor. How likely is it, or rather how dependent on a small number of people, maybe even one, is your project, such that if they get acquired or get a job somewhere, your open source project is no longer going to be maintained? That's one. And correct me if I mess up any of these, by the way. And then there's contributor confidence, which I don't quite know how to define. We'll come back to that. There's YOLO coders who just push to main without any sort of process. But maybe we can correct my understanding of contributor confidence, and then I can tell you one idea I have about this.
Yeah, so the confidence is, and we have a few other ones, like outside contribution. Outside contributors, I think is how we're going to call it. We don't have a special name for it. That one's also in progress as well, and currently in our API. So you can, any repo, you can see the outside contributor rate, and if you go to the API directly.
Is that contributors from outside your org, or what is outside?
Outside the org. Yeah, so outside contributors actually is a phrase and a term on GitHub. So it's literally as it states. Rate of self-selection is the statistics term, which is basically like core team versus not core team. And interesting the thing to look at too as well, because TypeScript is 0% of outside contributors of like last half of last year. So interesting story there. But contributor confidence. So confidence is basically because everyone goes for stars. And I've got a story about Cal.com too as well. But everyone goes for stars. But like, what's the if the goal is to grow a community through contribution and interest, like through comments, what's the likelihood of someone actually participate and engage in the project? So like if you're open source and not closed source, like the benefit is you get engagement through like you have a place where people can talk about your project through discussions or issues. So if you star a repo or if you fork a repo, it's basically weighted. So you have to give a certain weight that interactor, or basically that we call them actors, but that actor interacts with your project. Now you attribute that to a score. So I think there was like roughly the average is around like 15 to 25%. Is going to be the confidence rating, which means like 25% of all folks who interact with your project will make a contribution. So there are some like extensions or markdown like documentation repos that will be like 40%. I just saw one today. 50.
So, sorry to interrupt you, but this percentage, does that interact with the repo? Does that mean with even just cloning it, or is it like write? So like comments and pull requests.
So we don't track clones right now because that's a GitHub API. Well, we probably add clones. I think we were just going for forks and stars because those seem like engagements that actually make a contribution. So the idea, and clones will also, if you clone the repo as a inside contributor, it muddies the mix a little bit. But forks and stars is what we're looking at. And then based on that, we want to see like comments as well. So interactions. So we just weight each one of those interactions. So stars are weighted the lowest, forks and comments are weighted higher. And then you basically, the chance of them interacting that's a percentage of everyone who interacts. That's a percentage of people interacting.
That's incredible. So you could even provide hints. So I'm just like brainstorming. You could you could then provide hints to companies going like, this person is like really confident with your project. Do you want to offer them a job? That is incredible. Okay, so awesome. Thank you for that. So I understand lottery factor, contributor confidence, outside contributors, YOLO coders, and I have an idea. Can I share with you an idea for one of these?
Please.
I think I would love to see like a bureaucracy or a barrier to entry score. As a user using OpenSauced, so not as a company, but as a developer, because like I've tried contributing to some larger projects, and there's understandable rate limiting. Like for example, you need to sign the contributor license agreement, and then you need to follow these conventions and sign this and do that. I call this bureaucracy, which again is needed. It's in the case of React, for example, it's very necessary. It would be cool if there was a signal for like, okay, I want to contribute to this, but what hurdles am I going to have to necessarily jump through to get there?
Yeah, this is like so like Angular is a good example as well, where it's a Google maintained project, and you actually don't get your PR merged by anybody at Google. They have a bot that does it. And I think Flutter also, like, there's another project where they don't even merge your PR, they recreate it with the bot and then merge it separately. So like all your commits go, but the actual PR gets regenerated, and like the bot's the author. So I think Flutter does this as well. But like this is like so the term I had internally, which is like, I'll throw this out there and get feedback, but I call them robo repos. So like if there's like a lot of like bots interacting through like get your contribution like looked at and maintained, and like very low human interaction, like there's like a robo repo score. But I think the other context is like governance. Like if you do have like bureaucracy governance, if you have proper governance, like a SIG group at Kubernetes, then you know what you're getting into. So like I think a lot of like, again, the Hacktoberfest the original goal for Hacktoberfest is like, can we just show spam and like check the box? But now it's like, okay, a bunch of people are like, oh, I want to like contribute to this project. Let me just clone React and like open a contribution, and like everyone gets dejected of like, oh, I thought I could contribute to React because I'm a good developer. But then they quickly realize, oh yeah, there's a lot more to this than just like, like I made a contribution to Node.js, and like running the test suite locally on my machine was like insane to the point where I had the Intel machine at that point, and it would just like take off. So actually, I got the team to help out with building code spaces, because I worked at GitHub at that point. So I could run my tests in code spaces and on the PR in code spaces. So I'd have to like run it locally on my machine. Yeah, it was a point where I was running a test and I was on Zoom, and it was like this is not going to happen. I had to like turn off my video because Node.js is running a test suite right now. But like those, I think that's like not a like bureaucracy is something that we should be able to highlight, like check a box. Like the robo repo is like a thing that we'll probably ship. I don't know about like how we sort of dictate of like yes, there is governance and structure, and like this is the charter. So like everyone looks at licenses, but like contributing guide or like this governance guide, like that stuff is a really good thing to highlight that exists because then people know what they're getting into. But also, if I'm a project, like the way I picked my license for OpenSauced is I went to Superbase and I was like, "Hey, Superbase, what'd you license and why?" And they're like, "Oh, Apache," because like it's not MIT, but we also get to protect our brand. So if you have like a Supa whatever, or if you like try to use their lightning bolt thing, like they can at least like protect their trademark. But like if you want to clone Superbase and do whatever, like that's totally fine. It just looks weird and no one will like you in open source, but it happens. So I was like, cool, we're Apache too. And like that's how kind of open source works. So if like I can go to another project, and be like, how does the governance work? And this project looks kind of like where I want to go. And I think, sorry, even step like I'm getting excited about this, but the reason to go top down is because if you want to be successful in open source and you want to build a company and you want to like grow contribution and community, you probably want to be like, you don't want to be Microsoft, but you want to be at that level of like, okay, people care about what we're building and what we're doing. And I think Superbase is a great example of like, they're building a really cool thing. And like, they have a really good open source journey and strategy. So if you want to be like Superbase, I would love to build a platform called OpenSauced to show you the steps of like what is successful, like what are the metrics that Superbase cares about, and like how could you also set that as your goal. So the thing we haven't talked about yet is the way to, when I was at GitHub, the way we did this at define top 100 repos. And this is how we interacted. This is how I did my DevRel job. You could look at stars, and stars is not really a great metric because then you get like all these random markdown templates and all these like free college textbooks. But the thing no one really looks at, and this is really the secret sauce too, is we're now like 90 minutes or 80 minutes in, unique issue authors. So if you take just how many people interact with just issues, and like say if you say unique people who open issues, how many of those folks are not core team members? Okay, now who are those people? How many of those represent companies or features or partnerships down the road? Because like if you open an issue, I had a conversation with Brendan Burns on my podcast, The Secret Sauce, and early day Kubernetes. Brendan Burns co-created Kubernetes. What they looked at was issues were interest, PRs were adoption. So if you had Red Hat, which happened with Kubernetes, in the issues inside of Kubernetes, there's probably a conversation to have with Red Hat. Be like, hey, Red Hat, you keep opening issues. Like, what are you building? Like, what's the conversation? Like, what's the journey? What's the story here? And what that turned into is like Red Hat eventually blessed Kubernetes as the solution for orchestration. And like they just told me about orchestration tools, but like they got blessed by Red Hat. But then you're like, someone's like keeps opening a PR. So like PG Vector, what I noticed last month is the Neon database. 60% of the contributions were from the co-founder of Neon database inside of PG Vector. So apparently, like they're doubling down on PG Vector. There's a story there. So like, I haven't talked to anybody at Neon yet. Well, I talked to their VP of product, but it's like, what's the journey? So I just threw out a video. And it's like, oh, I don't know what this is, but this is, and we just kept like pulling out a thread, and eventually we got to YOLO coding. It's like, oh, Andrew Kane is doing stuff on the main, but he still answers PRs. And the journey of Andrew is he doesn't do podcast, but he is employee 10 at Instacart. So like he's just like he's doing pretty well for himself because of that IPO. So he's not as interested in open source or the journey. He just wants to solve hard problems. So he's just going to ship code and do a bunch of fun stuff and like live his life, which is like it's not a bad thing. It's just like a thing that I think everyone should just know what they're getting into when they start installing PG Vector, which is like you probably are not going to get a bunch of emails answered from Andrew, but maybe he'll answer his comments, or maybe he'll answer your PR in like a couple days or maybe a couple weeks. But like that's the journey that if I want to interact and build a big business and a company and become like the Superbase or become Microsoft, at least I know what the steps are to get there.
That's on my Apple, I use Apple Health, and there's this app that I have that shows me today
You're taking 4,000 less steps at this time of day that you take on average every month. And it's so there's like an upward trend in sort of the background in gray, and there's today's trend in the foreground, which is orange. And I think this is so cool to explore a new project in its journey, in its like chronological arc, in contrast with something like Superbase. So if somebody, like you said, is building something cool, you can, through OpenSauced or some really great like storytelling UI, show them, hey, Superbase was here at this time after starting the project, and you're here. So here are the steps you need to do to fill that gap. I think that is tremendous.
Yeah, and it's Star History. Get Star History is a project by some database company. I forgot what it was, but they have this with stars, and I think everyone tells that story of stars. So like Make Plain, the story that I was talking about like last year and where they were before was they tweeted out, "We are the most popular open source Jira project to date," and like they show their stars going like this, and they show like two blurred out competitors, like not going up in stars. And like that's a really good story if you want to go raise like around the VC. I think VCs are pretty up to speed on like, okay, that's kind of dumb, but depending on who you talk to, like people will invest in that. But like that's a way to tell a story. But I think we're now up to speed. Like stars don't really matter as much because like you get a bunch of stars and then a year later it doesn't matter. But if you're like, again, go back to issue authors, like this is the interest. Like I was talking to a founder yesterday, had a coffee, and I had a coffee with him because I'm like, I saw him speak at his meetup. And he's like, we went through all of our first 100 stars and we talked to all of them. Like, no one does that. I was like, dude, why? How'd you even think to do that? He's like, because like he's the one non-technical founder. So he's technical, but he's not as technical as his other co-founders. So he's doing the go-to-market CEO stuff. But he's like, I got to find my first 100 true fans. So if you're going to start the repo, why don't I just have a conversation, find out like, you started the repo, like, did you get to try it? Like, what's the feedback? What do you think you would build with this? Like, what do you think the project is? Like, just have like the general product discovery conversations with just the first 100 people who started your project. I honestly, I had not heard of anybody to date do that.
Yeah.
And it's mind-boggling. And that will be a part of our product, which is like, here are your first 100 stars. Like, feel free to find out who they are and like what they're doing.
Well, no. Instead of that, here's your first 100 stars. Our AIs have crawled the web and found out who they are for you. Go on. I mean, So this was actually a rule back with Replay. So I did work with Replay in a consulting fashion some time ago, and Jason Lasker, the CEO, had this thing where he was like, "Look, if you're doing DevRel, I want you to be able to tell me." As our community is small, I don't think he said 100 stars specifically, but like a cohort of our early adopters, I want you to be able to tell me who they are and the name of their dog. I want you to know them that intimately. And I think that's super valuable to get to know your people. Okay, I'd like to start wrapping up our discussion, talking a bit more about building the company. And so I want to pull on some threads here. I want to start by pulling on the thread of the hardest problem of founding and running OpenSauced, because here's why. There's a really, I'd say, surprising take by some founders, technical founders. So I'm speaking specifically of Glauber Costa from Terzo, who is, I mean, he's a compiler, like a low-level C engineer, right? Very, very competent engineer. And then there's also Brandon Bayer from Flight Control. A bunch of technical founders have said that, yeah, the product is interesting and very difficult to build, sure. But the hardest, the exceedingly exponentially more difficult problem with founding a technical developer-focused company is the positioning and messaging of it. How do you tell the right story? How do you build the right narrative? How do you use the right words to like tell people what you do and then compel them to use it because it's valuable? How do you communicate that value proposition? Do you agree with that? Has your experience been different?
Yeah, so that's a good question too as well. And like my background, like what I shared a bit, like I am technical, but also have the non-technical background. So a finance degree, did sales, did DevRel for a bit. So like the storytelling thing is like it's fine with me. And I think it is challenging to figure out like how do you sell your product? How do you talk about how to use it? And I think you got to be okay with like folks not getting it and not being a user or a buyer of the product early on. Because that's better value than people are like, oh, this is so cool. I love this cool stuff. This is a cool thing. And it's like the mom test, which is like a book by, I forgot who wrote it, but basically if you ask your mom, like, hey, mom, do you like this? Do you like OpenSauce? And she'll be like, oh, yeah, it's nice, honey. But like, you can't ask that question. You got to be like, "Hey, mom, I know that you have a pain point, or tell me about the pain points you have in open source." And be like, "Oh, I'm not the right person for that." Cool, I should move on. But a lot of times they're like, "We're like,
Sorry.
do you
Yeah.
like this?" Yeah, sorry, you're gonna respond to that.
No, I was just gonna laugh because I can't imagine going to my mom and going, like, "Mom, what pain points do you have with open source?" That's a brilliant
Yeah.
test. I just wanted to. That's by Rob Fitzpatrick, the book, excellent
Yeah.
book. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so basically, like for me, I would say like the challenge is like I am so invested and want to see this thing happen. I'm so close to like the sauce and like know exactly like why you would use it and who should use it. And like I'm ignoring people and like curving a bunch of maintainers who want to put notifications in our product. Because like what most maintainers want, they want us to like list their PRs and like get notifications on things that are ready for review. Like that's a GitHub feature. Like that exists already. It's called pull reminders. And but like they don't know that. So like I don't want to be DevRel for GitHub, and I don't want to build a feature that already exists that they'll discover eventually that GitHub can just turn on. So but the storytelling is like, okay, I got to be as convicted of the story enough that when I go into conversation this afternoon with a very large enterprise, like I know what the story is for them because I've done all my research. I know exactly how they would approach building, like using this product. And if like they come on board, I've sustained the growth of the company. I've sustained the future storytelling of like how we do expand. Because like the company I talked about this afternoon is expanding into enterprise. So like I can now do private enterprise stuff with them. Eventually, like we're not doing it out the gate, but now we have like a broader story. And even when I shared that open source journey to eventually enter source, like even like when I said this to you, like your eyes lit up of like, oh yeah, it makes sense, of course. And it's because we have that journey that I have to like constrict into. Today we could do this, tomorrow we could do that, and like that tomorrow will always change, and today will always get bigger. And so. But it's still very hard because, like, again, I just talked to somebody on Friday, a company that's like a ideal customer bottom up for us, but they were very clear, like they're friendly. I don't know them, but like they're friendly. We've crossed paths quite a bit, and they're just like, hey, I kind of just want to know what your product is. Be like, keep seeing it everywhere. Like your awareness is off the charts because we've got really good awareness around how we talk about our product and how we put ourselves in places, and our fun pizza brand. But they're like, I don't know what the product is. And I think even you and other folks that probably are listening to this are like, yeah, I never knew what open source was. I just know I like BDougie. I like the idea of what he did. I like his track record, but I don't know what the product is. And that's probably harder. It's like, okay. Are you okay if you don't know what the product is for another 6 months while we still have these other larger conversations so I can guarantee sustainability of this product and like guarantee our next round? Because if I tell you what the product is and you use it, you're gonna take a lot of energy for me to like keep you interested when I'd rather just like make this sustainable top down. But honestly, when you were asking the question, I was thinking about something different, which is I personally was I stopped working at GitHub because I wanted to write code and build something. So for 3 months, I built OpenSauced, and after those 3 months, we got very good traction, interested from DigitalOcean and the other company I mentioned before. Well, I didn't mention their name, but I mentioned them. And I was like, cool, there's a business and there's like a top-down angle. The hardest part was me like not coding anymore because I'm like, oh, I'd spent so much time writing code. I spent so much time not writing code, doing side projects. But I had to like make the decision to hire Brandon, was like first engineer, to basically say, I am not going to write any more code. I need to like trust a team to build this while I have these like very expensive conversations.
Okay, yeah. I love the brand, by the way, the pizza you mentioned. And I feel a follow-up question to this is, you mentioned the marketing and positioning, given your background, isn't as big of an issue. I have to ask, like, if there was a new company founded by a technical founder like yourself, even maybe with the same background, how do you, because you mentioned you're prioritizing this top-down approach as well, how does one meet those people? I mean, you're super well networked because of your career in DevRel and GitHub, and Netlify and all of this. Assuming like a founder who, just began, but they've been like an AI researcher this entire time and they've never spent any time at meetups and conferences.
Yeah.
I get this doesn't line up with your lived experience. So you maybe, the mom test would fail here. You maybe don't have the answer, but I'm like, what is it? Just move to SF and attend events? Is that the secret sauce?
It's that, or it's like get an angel investor that's well networked and well connected that can get you off the ground in 6 months. But it's like you get the angel investor, like after 6 or 12 months, like you've got to be able to pick up the baton and do it yourself. It's like you can't lean on unless you have a co-founder that will do that instead. So like I was in the gym this morning. I was thinking about this because like I was bench pressing, and I've been bench pressing since I was like, I don't know, 14, because I played high school football. And like working out for me is like not a thing that I have to put a lot of thought into. Like counting macros and protein and like, calories is not a thing. Like I definitely should be counting calories for sure. Like I could lose another 10 pounds. But what I'm getting at is like I go in the gym. I know what I need to do. I know exactly what muscles I need to target to. I'm already past the point where I don't have the like I'm not trying to build muscles. So like I'm not checking a box and having like my apps and stuff like that. It's just like it's a natural thing that I've just been doing it for so long. I'm 37 now, so like the years that I've been put on, if I got to be in the gym, if I know what I need to do, I know how to do it. So like when I go to an event at SF or anywhere in the world, like I know how to like work the room. I know how to like ask the questions and like make the connection. And like using my goal is like if I connect with two people I haven't met before that could potentially be a great conversation or like a friend or a network later, then my job's done. Like I don't have to sit, I don't have to be there until 12 a.m. trying to like continue to like get more and more information. It's like, hey, well, let's just jump on a call like after the fact. I'm happy to change numbers, join a LinkedIn. And I specifically use LinkedIn for that because like I'll lose you on X because I've got too much stuff happening over there. But yeah, I would say like honestly, the answer is like you got to start yesterday. Like if you're not already at events, I remember going to events as a junior engineer and like I remember one senior engineer like commenting of like, "Oh yeah, Brian, you like going to events. Do you want to speak at this meetup?" Very first meetup I ever did, and I was like, "Yeah, sure." Like I want to be known. I want to like leverage my network to like level up my skill set because that's how I became a better engineer. Is just talk to people who are better than me, and that should be the goal. Is like just find people who have more impact or more reach, and like I read the book How to Win Friends and Influence People once a year.
Great book. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's not my Bible, but it's a thing that I because I'm an introvert. Like I grew up very shy, quiet, and the one thing that broke me out of it is read that book and take a sales job. Because when I had to make 30 calls, because back then you didn't do emails, you called on the phone 30 times, and that was your minimum quota. You had to call, so like I got to figure out how to do this because I got to like make a like I want a job, I want to like start a family, got to do this stuff. So I learned it, and it's always. I talk like I'm talking here because I'm the guest, but like I do a podcast because I want other people to talk. So I'm asking thought-provoking questions. I'm already asking the next question before you finish your thought. So then I'm like, oh, cool. Tell me about. I remember like I was at my kid's school and this dad's from Ireland, and I'm like, I was just in Ireland a couple years ago with the wife, and great time. We went up the hills of Scotland. I was asking about his like childhood and like where he grew up and like what it was like. What are the foods that you eat in Ireland? It's got to be more than potatoes, right? And then you're like asking them questions where they're just telling stories and I'm just listening. And I'm like the I don't know what the equivalent is, but like there's a lot of big podcasters out there, like Mark Maron, the WTF podcast, which I'm not sure if it still goes on. But I've actually, because I was an introvert and I knew I wanted to do a podcast, I listened to that podcast like I'd go through a whole backlog, subscribe to the newsletter and all this other stuff, because the way he asked questions of like sometimes you ask a question, it's like a soft pitch, a softball, and then you ask like the hard question, which is like, oh yeah, tell me about this thing. Or like, hey, like the thing I've been talking to AI founders is like, hey, it's a crowded market. Like, how do you even stand out with that? Like, you're just doing that in LLMs. Like, don't you think like Azure is going to like eat your lunch, Azure AI Studio or whatever? And they're like, oh yeah, well this and this. Oh cool. Like, let's dig in and like let's get into the real nugget, the secret sauce. So my entire so basically I've been doing this since I moved to San Francisco. Before I moved to San Francisco, I host a podcast called This Developing Story, which I don't do anymore, which is like 15 minutes, ask 3 questions. Who are you? What do you do? And how did you get here? If I'm in person at a San Francisco event, I'm like, oh, hey, what do you do? Oh yeah. It's like a under soft pitch. How did you get here? Like, what's this journey of you becoming CEO of this company? And you just treat everyone like a human being. Like no one's a superstar. So if I'm talking to Elon, I'm talking to you like I'm talking to him just like he's a normal person. Like, hey, cool. Tell me about that lawsuit you're going through right now. And I think if you listen to like my Solomon Hikes podcast episode, I get to the point where I ask him the question of like, why did Docker fail? Because like we spend all the time like, oh, I didn't know he was like from Paris or he was spoke French. Actually, I never heard the guy talk before until like the week before the podcast. I listened to a conference talk, and he had a little slight accent. He sounds way more Canadian because he lived in Canada. But you get to the point where you're comfortable with them, then you're like, tell me why Docker failed, which is not a thing you lead with, but it's a thing that you're like, when you're comfortable with a person, you're like, what's that journey? Like, how did we get there? And like, it was a great, like, earnest, like, strong answer, where a guy who like sat and thought about that for years gave me that answer. And I don't think you could Google that and be like, that wasn't from him telling the story of like why. But we ended up getting that on the podcast.
Incredible. Wow. I will put links to all of this in the show notes, especially the podcast you're running now called The Secret Sauce. I'm a fan. I watch all your shorts. Recently the one with Evan New, and I think it's just tremendous. So and also I think it's evident in the discussion we're having here. You're contributing to such a high quality discussion because you yourself run a podcast. So I wanna thank you for that. And gosh, for an introvert to sit here and talk for as long as we have. Thank you so much. I want to. I'll ask you my last question, and then we can say goodbye and go about our days. Which is, this question is something I've been asking every single founder on the series, because and the context for it is we've been so last year I was sitting with some founder friends, and they also happen to be CEOs of their startups, and they all had very different experiences, and the general feeling in the room was, man, nobody prepares you for this stuff. And I thought, what if it would be like, HTML is like a living standard. It's a specification. So is JavaScript and stuff. I was like, what if there was a document like that, but for like technical founders, like something you can't, everybody's experience is different, but I wonder if there's like commonalities that you can sort of tease apart and put into like a charter, like a living standard of like, this is something that happens. This is something you need to know. This is something you can expect. So I've been asking this to literally everyone in this CEO/founder series. Matt Bielman from Netlify, your previous boss, said,
Yeah.
You've got to be able to adapt because things are one way today and they're another way tomorrow. David Khurshid from Stately agrees with that. Stephen Fabre, the CEO of LiveBlocks, mentioned the importance of design engineering and really creating beauty as opposed to function, and having them like complement each other. So that's just some things that everyone has sort of contributed. I'm curious, in your experience, what would you add to such a document?
Yeah, I mean, those are really good too as well. And maybe I'm like, this is too on the nose, but it is really talk to your users, talk to your customers, because like it's one of those things where you're just like, well, we had this customer who's been a customer for like almost since the beginning. Like as soon as we had the pricing, they paid for the product, and like our product has shifted a few different times since then, but they've been around. And like and eventually this year, so he's paid for the product for a year, and they're like, cool, can we just like set up a bi-weekly call, or every other week we just like have a conversation, because you're clearly bought into like what we're building, the vision. Like they want to build a successful open source project, but we need information from you. So like, let's chat. And like the conversation, like we talked to the head of DevRel, and they're coming from a different angle than someone who built an open source project from the ground up and now has a company. And which is like, I've got to go talk to our board about our success, and it can't just be stars every week or every month. So like, what's the journey? What's the story? Like, how do I dig in? And what we found out from those conversations is like, people just want opinions about open source. And those opinions have been really tried and true. Like if you have 10,000 stars, you're famous. But like what people don't know is like, you're in the top 1%. If you have over, I think 12,000 stars or 14,000 stars at this point, you're the top 1% of all GitHub. So if you just get over 12,000 stars, you're in the mix. But no one knows what that is. Like no one knows that's the barrier. But then what is that like? Then when that barrier goes up higher, it's not 20,000 stars or 50,000 stars. Because now like when I started at GitHub, Vue had 60,000 stars, and now it's like 200 and something. Or no, React is 260. Vue is like 220 maybe. I don't know. But what I'm getting at is like now it's like enough. Like there's a saying, if you eat enough lobster, it starts to taste like soap. So like stars are now like soap. It doesn't matter. So
right.
What we've learned through these conversations, these discussions with like our users, and a handful of them we meet with every other week on a cadence.
Wow.
Just because like the information they give us is so valuable, and like we give them the product for free, it doesn't even matter. But the value we're getting is now justifying the larger conversations of like, oh, okay, we're good. But then the larger conversations of having like a cadence, like if you pay a certain amount, like you get a meeting with me every other month, me and the team, like even those are valuable. So it's like, we'll just cut Like if it's hard to get a call going, like we'll do once a quarter and we'll cut the price because like you don't need to meet us as much. You give us some time back, but that value of us meeting with you and like finding out, hey, how did that thing we shipped last week, how did it go for you? You didn't see it? Oh, cool. Can we give you a demo? Cool. Can we also like set up another thing where like you try this out, give us feedback, and if you invite like 10 people, then you get like it free or whatever. Like that's all the stuff we can get like in a comfortable conversation. So I can ask like, hey, why did this feature failed, and get an earnest answer, as opposed to like no one's responding to my newsletter or no one's responding to like our product hunt launch. I thought this was successful, but it apparently wasn't, and like everyone's too polite to tell us like what we did wrong.
Right. So I love that. Listen to you. This was also something that Matt Billman said, but he added a dimension of time to this, which I thought was so profound. He's like, because there's a stage where it's too early to talk to them. You're building something novel and the mind can't yet comprehend it. So he added almost a caveat to what you said, which is, yes, obsess over your users and talk to them regularly, but do so in a timely way. And I'm almost like composing both of your thoughts together in this context. Well, with that, listen, Brian, I know it's early in your day, and we've covered so much. I'm so excited about the things you're shipping and the things that are in progress. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us about open source, OpenSauced, everything in between, the value proposition, how y'all are getting the most out of it, and all of this. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Brian Douglas, or BDougie. I hope you found it as insightful as I did. I hope you understood GitHub, how it works, where it's limited, and how OpenSauced is filling the gap with observable and analyzable open source metrics for enterprise first, but soon for regular developers. If at all you had the question of what does OpenSauced even do, I hope you have the answer now. I certainly do. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, I'd invite you to support the channel on YouTube by subscribing and leaving a like on this video and maybe sharing it. If you're listening on Apple and or Spotify, if you could leave up to a 5-star review, that'd be a great way to support the podcast and make sure it gets in front of more people. Thank you so much for sticking around. Thank you for being a part of this discussion. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.